My name's Lisa Thompson, and I'm Vice President with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation in Washington, D.C., and I'm here with Julie Bindel. I'm very excited about this opportunity. Julie is an investigative journalist, an author, an advocate who has been working on issues of sexual exploitation for many years. How long have you been working on this?
For 35 years on violence against women, and for just over 20 particularly on prostitution and the sex trade.
Wow, so that's quite a lot of history in terms of the expertise that you've acquired over that time. So Julie has just finished writing a new book called The Pimping of Prostitution, Abolishing the Sex Work Myth. And she's in town, and we wanted to get a chance to talk to Julie and talk through some issues. So let's start with one issue in particular. We've learned recently that DC Councilman David Grasso has introduced a proposal to fully decriminalize prostitution here in Washington, D.C. So for the viewers, would you please explain what fully decriminalized prostitution means, and then let's talk a little bit about why that's such a bad idea.
What many people and many citizens think, who know no better because they're not involved in this issue, is that decriminalisation simply means stopping arresting the women or men or anyone who is prostituted. What it actually means is decriminalising pimping, brothel owning and sex buying. And it's the same with legalisation. The only difference between legalisation and decriminalisation is that under legalisation there are supposed to be more measures, more checks, more state interference. With decriminalisation, and we only have one example of this in New Zealand, which everybody holds up as the gold standard model that we should all aspire to, it is like the Wild West. You have brothel owners who are every bit as abusive now that they're called managers than when they were called pimps, and the form that you have to fill in to acquire a licence for a brothel in New Zealand is exactly half the length at 3 pages as the form we have to fill in my country to adopt a stray dog or cat from the rescue centre.
You know, that's a really telling point, because the sex trade, prostitution, it's a system that around the world people recognize that it's imbued with violence, that it's just drenched in predation, and yet you have a system that's been set up where it's easier to it's harder to adopt a pet than it is to sell women. So that's
right.
staggering.
And I don't know why your politician is trying to introduce a model that has failed, that is quite clearly a model that puts women in more danger and gives more power to organised criminals and to pimps, and certainly less rather than more power and control to the prostituted women. Let's just focus on New Zealand, because the Netherlands and Germany has been discredited. Nevada has been discredited. We know that legalisation has been an unmitigated disaster because the politicians there have admitted it. Both the Netherlands and Germany are looking to pull back from its legalised regime. And interestingly, Germany actually started off decriminalised. So decriminalisation can lead to the hell of legalisation with mega brothels and all the rest of it. But New Zealand, so the argument goes that it breaks the link between organised crime and the sex trade because the brothel owners have to be vetted, so they can't be convicted felons. Well, there's a way around that, there always is. There's something called SOOBs, small owner operated brothels, which do not require a licence and in which up to 4 prostituted people can work. Some brothel owners own 10 or more of these. They're not inspected, there's no regulation whatsoever, and for every licensed brothel there are scores of SOOBs. Now, the other thing that we need to consider is how, when you take away any law enforcement focus on a particular issue, in this case such as the sex trade, it becomes a matter for the local municipality to check on health and safety, etc. Well, for my book, I acquired hundreds of freedom of information requests. Do you have those here? So FOIs on all of the local authorities across New Zealand in all its towns and cities that have brothels to ask how many brothel inspections there have been, because they're supposed to be mandatory and they're supposed to be, I think it might be biannually, but certainly regularly, since decriminalisation came into effect in 2003. And these FOIs, the responses that we got, went up to 2014. Guess how many brothel inspections had been carried out across the whole of New Zealand?
I'm guessing it's probably 0.
11.
Okay, I'm impressed.
11, and these were because of complaints from the public.
Wow.
So it is the Wild West if you remove police intervention from pimping, brothel owning and trafficking. Of course, that's what you get. The other thing that would happen if you introduce the New Zealand model anywhere else is exactly what's happened in New Zealand. You have more women entering the sex trade, you have more sex buying, therefore you have more risk of HIV, new HIV cases, rather than fewer, which was the argument of the government. And of course in New Zealand, despite the fact that this is a country where you have to get on an aeroplane and stay on it for 4 hours before you reach dry land, there's trafficking of women into New Zealand, because supply and demand both grows under this model, and you've got more prostitution, not less.
Right, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, because when you fully decriminalize prostitution, you are sanctioning sex buying behavior. So in a sense, you're codifying the notion of sexual entitlement. You're saying that men actually, that there's a right that exists to be able to buy people. And who is doing the buying? It's predominantly men.
Oh, it's almost all men.
Yeah. And
also, street prostitution is a massive problem. At St Kilda, one of the notorious areas in Auckland, New Zealand, post-decriminalisation, numbers increased by fourfold. So there were 4 times the number of prostituted women on the street. And it's not a pretty sight. These women are as disenfranchised as they ever were. The one good thing about it, of course, is that the women are no longer arrested. But you can deal with that under the Nordic model, or the abolitionist model as we call it, where any prostituted person is decriminalised, which I think is the right thing to do, and I don't know any campaigners on this side of the fence that don't. But at the same time, you criminalise sex buying, and you criminalise the exploiters, the pimps, the brothel owners, and provide exit strategies and support for women who wish to leave the sex industry, which is almost at 100%.
Right, so let's talk a little bit about the women who make up the preponderance of those who are in prostitution. I know this definitely plays out in New Zealand, but around the world, like, there's such a predatory dependence upon minority women, women of color, women from, who have homelessness backgrounds. Can you speak to that?
Well, child sexual abuse is one of the training grounds for prostitution. I'm not saying every single woman in prostitution has been sexually abused as a child, but there are a lot of women, and homelessness and domestic violence, as you've said. But also, one really important thing to remember is that the sex trade is reliant on racist ideology and racist practice, and of course colonialism. So if you look at any native peoples, any indigenous, Maori, women from the communities that are the most marginalised, the First Nation people, there is a huge representation of those women. They're overrepresented in the sex trade. And often the worst things happen to them, such as the murdered and missing women in Vancouver. And then you have a massive overrepresentation of African American women in the sex trade. And it goes without saying that women are from the poorest backgrounds often, or even those who are from middle class backgrounds but who've had the misfortune to meet a pimp. There are, like, the 1% that have decided that this high class escorting is better than working in a factory, and they weren't pimped, and they have had lucky escapes in that they haven't had their children removed or got addicted to narcotics or faced additional violence from the prostitution sex. And these are the women and men that tend to speak for the majority, and it gives a wholly false impression.
One of the things that we hear a lot is that this somehow represents a progressive view towards, liberating. It's sex positive. It's supposed to be progressive, a human rights approach to the issue of prostitution. And I mean, to me, there could be absolutely nothing more antithetical than prostitution and human rights. But could you speak a little bit to that?
It's the most regressive view of sexuality and sexual practice that I've ever seen. For one thing, it actually relies on the politics of inevitability and pessimism.
Yes.
It says there's always been a sex trade, there always will be, let's just try and keep the women as safe as possible. Well, we don't say this about child poverty or racism or war. We say we want to end war, we want to end child poverty, and we work towards that. But it also says something terrible about men. And it's not what feminists say about men. What feminists say about men is that they're born babies and then they grow up under patriarchy and they are given power whether they want it or not, and there are some men who choose not to use that power to abuse women and exploit women and discriminate against women, but there are many men who just go through life using that privilege and not even realising they have it. And within that, of course, within that privilege, it means that men can use force or coercion or abuse to keep us in line. And prostitution is only possible under patriarchy. If we could see equality between men and women, which of course is the goal of feminism, then prostitution could not exist. Under this model. It couldn't. So it's a cause and a consequence of women's oppression. But what sex buyers have told me, and this is echoed by the pro-prostitution lobby and by many citizens who really are ignorant on this and who've absorbed the mythology about it, is that if they weren't able to go and get sexual release from a prostituted person, a one-sided sexual release where consent isn't available unless money is exchanged, they would have to go and rape a real woman, quote unquote. So what they're saying is, these so-called progressives, is all men are potential rapists, men can't keep control of their sexuality, and they're saying there is a subclass of women, often of colour or native, but always disadvantaged, who are available for men as spittoons for their semen. And that is the most gross view of class, of race and culture, and of men and of women. So it's a view that belongs in the Dark Ages as a relic in the museum.
It's hard to believe that here we are today in this time period that we're filming this. We're having conversations about Harvey Weinstein and sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. But yet I feel like this proposal that David Grasso has made, that it's really equivalent, that he is to vulnerable women in DC what Harvey Weinstein is to women in Hollywood by making this proposal, because the prostitution, it's on the job sexual harassment. That's your job, is to be sexually harassed, assaulted, and abused for a living. So it's really an outrage that he's made this proposal, and I'm so grateful you could come and speak to us today and just give us a glimpse into parts of the world where this has happened, when the tragedies that have happened to women as a result. And I want to encourage everyone to please be sure to get a copy of Julie's book, The Pimping of Prostitution, Abolishing the Sex Work Myth. It's incredibly powerful. She's one of the most articulate spokespersons for our cause in the world today. You don't want to miss this. It's incredibly powerful. If you care about women, read this book. And also be sure to let the DC City Council know that sexual exploitation is nobody's job.